Hello guys, and welcome to another video. And this one we're going to be doing a bit of discussion on exactly what an ambitious league for Path of Exile's 3.23 release might look like. And if you've missed the communication from GGG, back at the start of October, they outlined their plans for the upcoming release schedule, including information about the delayed release of 3.23 due to the scope being quite ambitious. So, the 3.23 expansion is set for an early December release, and my best guess would be that the league launch date will fall on Friday, December 8th, which would mean that the reveal livestream with all of the juicy information, including the patch notes, should fall on Thursday, November 30th, 8 days before league launch. I expect we'll be getting concrete dates for those very soon. So, let's start off with the big topic. That's an Atlas expansion. Will 3.23 ship alongside an Atlas expansion? Firstly, what exactly can be categorized as an Atlas expansion? Well, 3.9 Metamorph League shipped alongside the Conquerors of the Atlas, which added Cirrus and his Conquerors as endgame bosses, as well as the Atlas Watchstone progression system and new gear influences. Then, in 3.13, a year later, the Maven was introduced alongside the Ritual League with further improvements to the endgame progression system. And most recently, in 3.17, alongside Arch-Nemesis League came the Siege of the Atlas expansion, introducing a further 4 endgame bosses, a whole new influence gear system, and the Atlas passive tree. Atlas expansions can be considered as giant endgame updates, and pretty much ever since just before Crucible League, people have been discussing the possibility of the new league including one. The speculation for Crucible League was logical because it fell into that 4-league release cadence for Atlas expansions. But it came and went and there was no Atlas expansion. Then, with ExileCon lined up to make big announcements for Path of Exile, the expectation was that the Atlas expansion had been held off from 3.21 so that they could work on it a bit longer and hype it up properly live on the stage at ExileCon. But once again, 3.22 came and went by with no Atlas expansion. However, this isn't to say that the game hasn't received any endgame updates in all of this time. In fact, back in the reveal livestream for 3.18, Sentinel League, Chris Wilson mentioned that their plan for every release leading up to the launch of Path of Exile 2 was to expand the endgame with smaller improvements instead of waiting for that one large annual release. This is exactly what they've been doing, with the addition of Uber bosses, Atlas memories, more Atlas keystones, and most recently, the introduction of Sanctum to the core game. In my opinion, the current endgame of Path of Exile is in the best place that it's ever been. However, a lot has changed since Chris made that statement nearly 2 years ago. The main thing being, of course, that Path of Exile 2 is now its own standalone game. So what about our classic Path of Exile? Can we expect to return to regular Atlas expansion release cadences? I'm not sure about that exactly, but I do think that with the games being split, it's likely that they want to reaffirm their position of developing both games in tandem, and to help boost player sentiment on this topic, they may just drop a big expansion right in time for Christmas, a slot which has historically been reserved for their most elaborate releases. How likely is an Atlas expansion in 3.23? Maybe? Okay, so let's say an Atlas expansion is off the table, a new endgame boss is not happening, what else could be ambitious in 3.23? Well, on the topic of endgame additions, there's one big one that players have been asking for the best part of the past 3 years, and that's the introduction of the Ultimatum League mechanic to the Path of Exile core game. The Ultimatum mechanic is very simple in design, and it's an interesting topic to discuss exactly why they haven't added it to the core game up till now. I believe at some point Chris mentioned that they had a plan or an idea for it, but I'm not sure exactly when that was. However, it looks like Ultimatum being added to the core game is very likely, and likely very soon too, judging by comments made by Chris in a recent interview with Luepe at Gamescom in Germany a few months back. When asking Chris why simple league mechanics like Sentinel and Ultimatum hadn't gone into the core game just yet, Chris had this to say.
Is there a simple reason why popular leagues like Sentinel and Ultimatum have not made it into core game yet?
Generally speaking, it's because we don't yet feel that the core game is ready for them. Now, with Ultimatum, maybe the game is a bit more ready. With Sentinel, we don't necessarily know that it fits in the core theme of Path of Exile, like, having floating laser robots following you isn't necessarily something we want in the dark fantasy, baseline game, but there are certainly elements of Sentinel we can wrap in, and for Ultimatum, I suspect you'll hear more news soon.
So it looks like an Ultimatum comeback is definitely on the cards for 3.23. And I think the most interesting thing about this is exactly how they're going to plan to implement it into the game, as one would assume that they would have added it much sooner if it was just a case of re-adding the league mechanic into the core game that we had in 3.14. We already have the Trial Master and all of his rewards accessible in the current game via the Tower of Ordeal's unique map. Is it possible that they'll rework this boss to fit back in with a new Ultimatum mechanic? Talkative Try had a great idea about how Ultimatum might be rolled into the core game, with the Tower of Ordeals being realised as a delve but up mechanic with ascending floor difficulty. I'll link his video on the topic down below. Regardless of how it happens though, I think Ultimatum coming to the core Path of Exile game with the release of 3.23 is very likely. Oh yeah. Alright, what else is on the cards? Well, there's one topic that has been very hot for the past several leagues, and that's a proper, meaningful balance pass. The last time we got one of those, yeah, it was a long time ago. We're talking several years ago at this point. You see, there was a time when every Path of Exile League release would come with a significant balance pass, which often freshened up the meta and meant that you never really knew exactly what was going to be the strongest builds of the league until you're going to get into it. However, starting around 3.17, this changed in a big way, and the skill balance shipped with leagues was often just a few minor tweaks to overperforming abilities. Unfortunately, this meant that for pretty much every league since then, the meta in terms of strong builds for league starting and endgame progression is already figured out, so there's barely any experimentation going on, and the same builds and ascendancies are dominating the ladders league after league. We're in serious need of a massive, sweeping balance pass at this point, and this is easily my most wanted part of 3.23. Even if we get literally nothing else, let this be the only part of the release, a giant balance pass, flushing out this stale meta entirely and ushering in a new era of builds. The chances of this happening, I think it's unlikely, sadly. Okay, what about balance elsewhere in the game then? Let's talk about Ascendancy Reworks, because they've been a big thing recently. In 3.21 we had two Ascendancy Reworks, the Saboteur and the Pathfinder. These were a bit of a surprise, especially since in the minds of many, these were two of the more undeserving classes when it comes to the need of a rework. But these were the two that they went with, and when quizzed on the topic during the Crucible Q&A with Ziggy D, Chris mentioned that many more Ascendancy reworks have been planned for 3.21, but they weren't happy with the polish of these changes, so they decided not to ship them with that release. The expectation then was that 3.22 would contain a lot more Ascendancy reworks. In fact, in my own predictions video with Try right before ExileCon, I predicted 5 or more Ascendancy reworks in 3.22, and boy oh boy was I wrong. In the end, we received another 2 Ascendancy reworks in Trial of the Ancestors, the Guardian and the Chieftain. Once again, these weren't necessarily the most in-need classes for reworks, but they were definitely a bit more in need than the previous 2. But this still left Assassin and most notably Gladiator in the gutter. Gladiator especially has been in the gutter for 7 straight leagues at this point, and desperately needs attention. Will we see more Ascendancy reworks in 3.23? I think we will. And one of them will be Gladiator. Surely. And of course, I can't really let this video go by without mentioning Melee, because I feel at this point it's basically become a wanted feature in every release that Melee is addressed in some way, shape or form. I don't really think that Melee is ever going to get the Path of Exile 2 treatment where it's completely overhauled from the ground up, especially considering that PoE 2 was supposed to be the highly anticipated fix to Melee when it eventually did arrive. But now that it's a separate game, where does that leave Melee in Path of Exile 1? Realistically, I feel like they could at least make some short-term changes to damage regarding Melee, especially archetypes like Bleed, which have been in a terrible place since 3.15. But larger, more significant changes? I'm not so sure. Will Melee get a look in 3.23? Yeah, don't bank on it. So what if the ambitious part of 3.23 is just the league mechanic itself? It could be a very deep league mechanic. It could even be Synthesis 2.0. I mean, it's definitely possible that the league mechanic will be really in-depth with lots going on, but at the same time, I kind of feel like we're due for one of the more simple, in-map league mechanics, where we just have more monsters to kill and more loot, and we're not incentivized to leave mapping, which has been the case in 2 of the past 3 leagues. I actually think that the chances of a very complex league mechanic are quite low, but it's certainly a possibility. And lastly, a bit of discussion on the Atlas passive tree and its keystones, because we got a whole bunch of them in 3.22, and a lot of these were actually very impactful to the endgame gameplay loop, so that was fantastic. I could definitely see more keystones coming in 3.23, probably not quite as many, but especially if Ultimatum is being added to the core game, I think new Atlas tree passives and keystones are quite likely to help augment that content. And there you have it, my take on what an ambitious 3.23 release might look like for Path of Exile. I hope you're excited for the upcoming league, I know I am, especially following Trial of the Ancestors, which turned out to be an incredible league. Comment below what you think an ambitious 3.23 might look like, and let me know what you want to see in the upcoming league. And if you've enjoyed this video, make sure you click the thumbs up and subscribe for more Path of Exile content in the future. And consider supporting the channel by becoming a member just like these guys. You can find out more by clicking the join button below the video. Thank you for your support, and thanks for watching. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.